From the day she was born, Dr. Henry Ashford's daughter had never known the weight of her own feet against the earth. Her legs were there, perfect, unscarred, delicate like porcelain, but they carried no life within them. The doctors called it a rare neuromuscular condition. A fancy name that meant one thing: she would never walk. Dr. Ashford was one of the best surgeons in the state. People said his hands could save anyone. But when it came to his own child, those same hands were useless. He had scrubbed into hundreds of operations, brought strangers back from the edge of death, but he could not give his little girl the one thing she wanted most: the chance to run, to play, to feel the wind chasing her hair. He poured his money into every possible treatment: top specialists, experimental therapies, custom-built devices from overseas. The results were always the same: disappointment. Another "I'm sorry" from another so-called expert. Another night of holding her small frame as she cried into his shirt. She grew up inside the protective glass bubble her father built for her. Homeschooling, private nurses, endless safety precautions. And maybe, just maybe, that bubble became as much for him as it was for her. He couldn't stand the thought of her falling, of her being hurt, of anyone seeing her as broken. By the time she turned 12, her world was the size of the Ashford estate: high gates, spotless halls, rooms big enough to echo yet empty of laughter. She filled her days with books and drawing. Her imagination was her escape, because reality never gave her the chance. But outside those gates, in the same city her father worked to heal, another life was playing out. A life on the cold sidewalks, where people kept their eyes down and stepped around the bodies curled under blankets that weren't really blankets. A life where the nights bit into your bones and the days burned your skin. And in that life there was a boy. Black, about 15, tall for his age but thin in a way that showed he hadn't eaten enough in a while. His clothes were a mix of whatever he could find: one sleeve torn, shoes too small. But his eyes carried something strange. Not bitterness. Not defeat. Something else. Nobody knew where he came from. Some said he'd been on the streets for only a few months. Others swore they'd seen him around since he was little. What they all agreed on was that he was different. He wasn't just surviving, he was watching. Like he was waiting for something. One rainy afternoon, Dr. Ashford's chauffeured car had to stop at a light downtown. That was when his daughter, staring out the window, saw him for the first time. He was crouched on the edge of the sidewalk, sketching in a battered notebook with a piece of charcoal. The rain slid off his curls, dripping onto the paper, but he didn't flinch. He was too focused. Her father didn't notice. He was on the phone with a hospital administrator. But she kept her eyes on that boy, something about the way he moved his hand across the page pulling at her. And just before the light turned green he looked up. Their eyes met. It wasn't long, maybe half a second, but it was enough for her to feel something she'd never felt before, like a thread had tied itself between them. She didn't know why. She didn't know how. But she knew it mattered. That night she dreamed of standing. Not in a hospital room, not in her father's study, but on a city street, the rain soaking her hair, while that same boy stood across from her, holding out his hand. She woke up with her heart pounding. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. But something inside her whispered, "You will." And that whisper was right. Because fate has a way of making strangers collide. And when it does, it doesn't care about rules or logic or the walls we build around our lives. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of day that felt unremarkable at first. Clouds hanging low, air heavy like it was holding back rain. Dr. Ashford was called into an urgent surgery, and his daughter was left in the care of her nurse, Miss Clara. They were supposed to be heading to her weekly physical therapy session, one more routine appointment she dreaded. Miss Clara always took the long way through the nicer parts of the city, but that day road construction forced them to cut through the heart of downtown. The car slowed at a busy intersection, and that's when she saw him again. The boy from the rain. Same messy curls, same too small shoes. He wasn't drawing this time. He was crouched next to an old man's cart, helping him gather up fruit that had rolled across the sidewalk. Something inside her jolted. That invisible thread from before, it pulled tighter. She found herself leaning forward, her hand pressing against the glass. Miss Clara noticed, following her gaze. "Don't stare, sweetheart," she murmured, but her voice was soft, not scolding. The light turned green and the car rolled forward, but not before the boy glanced up. And just like last time their eyes met. Only this time he smiled. Not a full, showy smile. Just the barest curve of his lips, like a quiet hello only meant for her. Later that week it rained again. She asked Miss Clara if they could take this shortcut through downtown on the way back from therapy. She framed it as curiosity, as wanting to see more of the city. Miss Clara, maybe sensing the harmlessness in it, agreed. And there he was, sitting under the awning of a closed shop, flipping through that same battered notebook. She couldn't see what he was drawing, but she didn't need to. She knew she wanted to. She asked Miss Clara to stop. The nurse hesitated, glancing between the boy and her. "We can't just..." But before she could finish, the girl's eyes pleaded in a way that said this was not just another childish whim. The car eased to the curb. Miss Clara stepped out first, the rain speckling her uniform. The boy looked up, cautious but not afraid. She gestured toward the car. "Someone wants to meet you," she said. He approached slowly, his steps measured, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. When he got close enough to see her sitting there, his expression shifted. It wasn't pity. It wasn't surprise at her wheelchair. It was interest. The same kind of interest she felt for him. He stopped just short of the car door. No handshake. No introduction. Just a moment where the world outside the three of them seemed to fade into silence. And then, quietly, he said something. Something that Miss Clara would later try to recount but never quite capture. All the girl knew was that his voice carried certainty. The kind that didn't sound like hope, but like knowledge. Like he had already seen the ending to a story that hadn't even begun. And whatever those words were, they made her believe, for the first time in her life, that maybe her story wasn't already written. Before Miss Clara could ask questions, the boy stepped back. The light changed, traffic stirred, and they were moving again. But the girl's hands gripped her lap tight. Because in her mind she was already replaying that moment over and over. The next morning she asked her father about something she had never asked before. "What would it take for me to walk?" Dr. Ashford gave the same answer he always did. The medical answer. The clinical truth. But she wasn't listening to the impossibilities. She was remembering the way that boy had looked at her, like the impossible was just the start. And somewhere out there on the streets, that boy was making a decision of his own. One that would bring him back to those iron gates no matter what stood in his way. 2 days later the rain stopped, but the sky stayed the same flat gray. Downtown smelled faintly of wet asphalt and damp cardboard, the scent of the streets after the world had washed itself overnight. The boy sat on the edge of the curb near the bus station, his notebook balanced on his knee, but he wasn't drawing. He was thinking. Ever since that moment outside the car, he couldn't shake her face from his mind. Not because she was beautiful in some fragile porcelain way, though she was, but because she carried the look of someone who'd been told no too many times. A look he knew well. And when you've heard no enough, it starts to live in your bones like weight you can't put down. He had no medical degree. No formal training. But he had something no one had ever asked him about. A gift. A strange, unexplainable thing that had followed him for as long as he could remember. He could place his hands on people and feel what was wrong. Sometimes it was like heat under his palms. Sometimes it was like a thread tangled up inside them, waiting to be untied. And when he worked, really worked, things changed. People on the street whispered about it. Some called him a miracle. Others said it was dangerous. He didn't care about the words. What mattered was that it worked. And now, for the first time, he wanted to use it for someone, not just to help, but to change everything for. He asked around. The people who sold flowers outside the bank. The woman who swept the cafe steps at dawn. The old man who pushed the fruit cart. Someone had seen her before, the pale girl in the wheelchair with the rich man's car. It took him 3 days to find out where she lived. The Ashford estate was nothing like the streets. The front gates were tall enough to keep secrets in and trouble out. The iron bars curled into shapes that looked expensive even in the shadow of the cloudy sky. He stood there for a long time just looking. His shirt was clean, he'd washed it in the sink at the shelter, but the hem still frayed. His shoes were still too small. He knew what he looked like from the other side of those gates, out of place, out of reach. A guard stepped forward, hand resting on his belt. "You got business here?" The boy nodded. "With the girl." The guard frowned, already reaching for the radio. "You mean Dr. Ashford's daughter?" The boy didn't answer. He just said, "Tell her I can help her walk." The words hung in the air like they didn't belong in it. The guard hesitated, not sure if this was a joke, a scam, or something in between. But maybe it was the way the boy said it, like fact not hope, that made him call inside. Upstairs the girl was by her window sketching. She liked to draw things she'd never seen in person: oceans, mountains, crowded markets. When Miss Clara entered telling her about some boy at the gate, her pencil froze. She didn't ask which boy. She knew. Moments later, Dr. Ashford appeared, his voice sharp with authority as he told her it was nonsense. "He's a homeless kid looking for attention, maybe money," he said. "You are not to entertain this." But something had shifted in her since that rainy afternoon. For the first time in her life she pushed back. Not with anger but with quiet insistence. "Let me see him," she said. Reluctantly her father allowed it, but only in the courtyard with him present. The boy was brought inside the gates, and as he stepped onto the stone path leading to her, he looked around not with awe, but with the calm focus of someone arriving exactly where they meant to be. When their eyes met again, it felt less like meeting and more like continuing a conversation neither had started aloud. He knelt in front of her chair, placed a hand gently on her knee, closed his eyes, and for a moment no one moved. Her father broke the silence. "This is absurd." The boy opened his eyes, meeting the doctor's gaze without fear. "It's not," he said. "But you have to let me try." Dr. Ashford had spent his entire career trusting only what could be measured, tested, proven. To him, medicine wasn't magic, it was science, and science didn't bend for stories told on street corners. Yet now, in his own courtyard, a boy in worn-out shoes was asking him to believe in something without proof. He wanted to shut it down immediately, to send the boy back through those gates and lock the world out again. But his daughter's eyes stopped him. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't desperate. She was looking at him like someone who had finally been handed a key to a locked door and wasn't going to let it go. Reluctantly, he agreed to give the boy 10 minutes. No promises, no commitments. 10 minutes, then it was over. The boy nodded like he had already won. He didn't reach for any tools, didn't ask for equipment. He simply rolled up his sleeves and crouched by her chair. His hands hovered over her legs, not touching at first, as if he was listening for something that no one else could hear. The air seemed to still. Even the leaves on the courtyard trees went quiet. When his palms finally settled against her knees, her first reaction was confusion. She expected nothing, maybe a faint warmth from skin against skin, but what came instead was a slow, deep sensation that spread downward, like sunlight spilling into places that had been dark for too long. Miss Clara noticed it first. "Her foot," she whispered. And when they all looked, they saw it. Her right foot, unmoving for 12 years, twitched. Just once, just barely, but enough to turn the air electric. Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his mind racing. He'd seen involuntary muscle spasms before. They could mean anything, or nothing at all. But there was something in the way her face lit up, the way her hands gripped the armrests as if bracing for more, that unsettled him. The boy kept working. His touch wasn't rough or forceful. It was steady, deliberate. His breathing matched hers, slow and even, as if syncing their rhythms. The twitch came again, stronger this time, traveling up her calf in a faint ripple. Her father's voice was tight. That could be reflex. The boy didn't argue. He just said quietly, "Or it could be the start." At exactly 10 minutes, Dr. Ashford ended it. He told himself it was to avoid giving her false hope, but deep down, it was because the possibility scared him more than the certainty. Certainty was safe. Certainty meant she would never walk. But possibility? Possibility meant he might have to admit he'd been wrong. The boy stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I can help her," he said. "But it's not a one-time thing. I'll need days. Maybe weeks." Dr. Ashford shook his head. "This isn't a charity case. My daughter is not your experiment." The boy didn't flinch. "She's not an experiment. She's a person who's been told she can't. I'm telling you she can." The words hung heavy. The doctor ordered the gates to be opened, ready to send him away. But as the boy turned to leave, the girl's voice broke through. "If you walk out now, I might never forgive you." Her father froze. She had never spoken to him like that. Never defied him so openly. He didn't answer right away. He watched the boy disappear beyond the iron gates, then looked back at his daughter, whose eyes were brimming with something dangerously close to belief. That night, he lay awake, replaying every twitch, every muscle shift, every tiny change in her face. Logic told him it was nothing. But the image refused to leave him. And somewhere deep inside, A crack had formed in the wall he'd spent years building around her. By morning he knew the truth, that boy was coming back. The boy returned 2 days later. This time he didn't wait at the gates. He walked right up to them head high as if he had been invited. And in a way he had, not by Dr. Ashford's words, but by the silence that had followed them. The doctor still didn't trust him. But that crack in his certainty had widened just enough to let the boy through. He told himself it was only to prove the twitch was nothing. Only to shut the door on false hope once and for all. Miss Clara wheeled the girl out into the courtyard. Her smile when she saw him was small, but it was the kind of small that carried more than it showed. The boy began without ceremony. His hands moved over her legs, his focus intense but calm. It wasn't just his touch, it was the way he seemed to listen through his fingertips, like every muscle and nerve was speaking to him in a language no one else could hear. Minutes passed and then, movement. Not just a twitch this time but a bend. Her right knee shifted, pulling ever so slightly inward. It was small, barely measurable, but it was enough to make Miss Clara gasp and the girl cover her mouth in disbelief. Dr. Ashford leaned forward, watching closely. His mind searched for explanations. Nerve flare, random contraction, coincidence. But the boy's steady hands and her growing control made those explanations harder to believe. By the third session both legs had shown movement. Small, shaky but undeniably there. The boy began to add gentle exercises, urging her to push against his hands, to try to send the signal from her brain all the way down. Sometimes nothing happened. Other times the muscles fired just enough to remind her they were still there. And with each flicker of progress, something else began to change. She started laughing more. Drawing less about places she'd never been and more about the courtyard, the boy's worn shoes, the way the light caught the leaves above them. The air around her felt different, like the heavy, invisible weight she'd carried all her life was starting to lift. But outside those gates, whispers began to grow. Neighbors asked questions. Staff at the estate shared murmurs. People wanted to know who this street boy was, why he was being allowed so close to the Ashford family. Some claimed he was taking advantage. Others said there was no way what he was doing was real. One afternoon, during a session, a tall man in a gray suit arrived unannounced. He was a hospital board member, a longtime colleague of Dr. Ashford. His eyes narrowed when he saw the boy kneeling in front of the girl. "This is dangerous," the man said later when the boy had gone. "You're letting an untrained stranger interfere with a complex medical condition. If something goes wrong, your reputation will burn with it." But the doctor's mind was no longer as sure as his colleague's voice. Every day his daughter's legs grew stronger. Every day the boy proved that maybe knowledge didn't only live in textbooks and white coats. Still, the pressure mounted. Calls from hospital administrators. Concerns from family friends. Even the security staff muttered about the street kid walking freely inside the gates. And the boy knew it too. He could feel the eyes on him, the tension in the air. But he never wavered. "We're close," he told her quietly after the 5th week. Closer than they want to believe. She didn't need convincing. She could feel it, the tingling in her calves, the burn in her thighs after each session. It wasn't pain. It was possibility. Then came the morning when she stood. Not fully, not without his hands steadying her, but her feet were flat against the stone, and her knees locked under her weight for the first time in her life. Miss Clara cried. Dr. Ashford turned away, pretending to study the garden. And the boy, his voice steady but eyes bright, said only, "We're not done yet." Because the hardest part wasn't getting her to stand. It was keeping the world from tearing it down before she could walk. It was early morning when she asked for the gates to be opened. Not for a car, not for guests, but for her. The air was crisp, the kind that carries both silence and promise. She wore simple clothes, not the dresses her father favored, but sneakers and soft pants that could bend and stretch. Her wheelchair sat behind her on the courtyard stones, empty for the first time since she could remember. The boy stood a few steps ahead, waiting. His hands weren't outstretched. He wasn't going to pull her forward. This had to be hers. Dr. Ashford stood nearby, arms folded tight. He hadn't told her not to try. Not today. But his eyes followed her every move, ready to catch her if she fell. The first step was nothing like she imagined. She thought it would feel like flight, like freedom rushing through her veins. Instead, it was work, every muscle in her legs screaming awake, every joint trembling under her weight. But she didn't stop. The boy's voice was steady, low enough that only she could hear it. Each word was a thread pulling her forward. One step. Then another. Her body shook, her breath grew sharp, but the earth stayed under her feet. Halfway across the courtyard she faltered. The world tilted, her knees buckled, and she felt herself start to fall. But before the boy could catch her, she pushed back, forcing her legs to hold, refusing the ground that had claimed her all her life. And then, she took another step. The sound of her father's voice broke in, thick with something he hadn't let her hear in years, pride. But she didn't turn to him. Her eyes stayed locked on the boy, the one who had seen her standing long before she believed she could. By the time she reached him, she was crying, not from pain, but from the weight of 12 years lifting off her shoulders in a single morning. He caught her, not to hold her up, but to steady her now that she was standing on her own. The staff watched from the windows. Whispers spread beyond the gates, turning into stories that would be told in shops and markets for weeks. The girl who never walked, had walked. And at the center of it was the boy nobody knew, the boy from the streets who had done what the city's best doctors could not. But miracles are heavy things and not everyone welcomes them. That afternoon a black car pulled up outside the gates. 2 men stepped out, sharp suits and colder eyes. They spoke quietly to Dr. Ashford, and though she couldn't hear the words, she knew the conversation wasn't about celebration. It was about control. When she came looking for the boy later, he was gone. His notebook lay on the garden bench, pages fluttering in the breeze. Inside, the last drawing was of her, not in her chair, not even walking but running, hair flying behind her, barefoot and laughing. She searched for him for days. Downtown, the shelter, the bus station. He had vanished the way he had arrived. Suddenly, completely, like he had only been meant to pass through her life long enough to change it. Her father never spoke of the men in the black car and she never asked. But she kept the notebook close and every morning she walked a little farther. And though she never saw him again, she carried his voice with her, that quiet certainty that had been there from the very start. You can. Because in the end he hadn't just given her her legs. He had given her back her life. If this story moved you, imagine how many more will leave you speechless. Subscribe to Dream Tales right now and turn on that bell, because the next story might just change the way you see the world.